A certified letter arrived at my house on an ordinary Tuesday, and by the time I finished reading the first paragraph, my hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. It was from an attorney representing a woman I hadn't thought about in 15 years, the anonymous egg donor my husband and I had used to have our daughter, back when anonymous was supposed to mean exactly that. She wasn't just reaching out. She was suing for partial custody, and she already knew my daughter's name, her school, and her face better than I ever thought a stranger could. My name is Rachel. I'm an architect, which means I spend my career designing structures meant to hold up under pressure, accounting for every stress point before it becomes a failure. I never imagined I'd need that same instinct applied to my own family, trying to identify exactly where the structure we'd built around our daughter's stability had a weakness we never saw coming. Mark and I struggled with infertility for almost 3 years before we found our way to an egg donor program. Those years took a toll I don't think either of us fully processed until much later. The specific grief of watching other people's pregnancy announcements arrive on social media, while our own attempts kept failing, quietly, one appointment at a time. We chose anonymous donation deliberately, specifically because the agency assured us in writing that neither we nor the donor would ever have identifying information about each other, now or in the future. That promise mattered enormously to us at the time, not because we were ashamed of how we built our family, but because we wanted our daughter's life defined entirely by the people actually raising her, without the complication of a donor relationship neither of us had asked for. I remember sitting in the clinic's small consultation room, reviewing donor profiles that gave us general information, health history, education, physical characteristics, but deliberately withheld anything that could ever identify a specific person. It felt, at the time, like exactly the right balance. Enough information to feel like a considered decision. Not so much that it would ever complicate the family we were building. The donor agreement itself was straightforward, at least as far as either of us understood at the time. The woman who would become our daughter's biological donor signed a comprehensive relinquishment of all parental rights and future claims, standard language in these kinds of anonymous arrangements. I hadn't thought about that document in over a decade. I certainly never imagined I'd need to locate our copy of it with any urgency. Sophie is 15 now, and her childhood has been, by any reasonable measure, wonderfully ordinary. We told her about her origins honestly from an early age, in simple, age-appropriate terms that grew more detailed as she did, never treating it as some dark secret, just one true fact among many about how her particular family came to exist. There was a picture book we read her as a toddler about different kinds of families, one page gently touching on donor conception in language a 3-year-old could absorb without confusion. By the time she was old enough to ask more detailed questions, around 8 or 9, we simply answered them honestly, the same way we'd answer any other question about her own history. It was never a source of instability. It was just information woven naturally into a childhood defined far more by soccer practices and school plays and ordinary sibling squabbles with her younger brother than by any question about her genetic origins. The letter changed everything about how untouchable that ordinary stability had felt. I remember rereading it 3 times at my own kitchen counter before I even called Mark at work, my eyes catching on specific phrases over and over. Identified through publicly available genetic matching services, seeking to establish partial legal custody, acting in what she believes to be the best interest of the minor child. The word identified felt like the most violating part of the entire letter, more than the custody language itself. Someone had been looking at my daughter, tracking details about her life, without any of us knowing it was happening. Mark and I sat at our kitchen table that evening, the letter between us, both of us circling somewhere between panic and disbelief. How does she even know Sophie's name? Mark kept asking, running his hands through his hair. How does she know what school she goes to? None of this should be possible. The whole point of anonymous donation is that this exact thing can't happen. We called a family law attorney that same night, unable to wait even until morning. Diane Okafor specialized in reproductive and family law, and she agreed to see us first thing the next day, hearing the genuine panic in our voices, even over the phone. I don't think I slept more than an hour that entire night, lying awake replaying every detail of Sophie's daily routine, wondering how much of it a stranger might already know. Diane's office was calm in a way that helped steady both of us, at least somewhat. She read through the letter carefully, then through our old donor agreement paperwork, which Mark had located in a fireproof box in our closet within an hour of the letter arriving. Her expression remained composed and thoughtful throughout, the kind of professional calm that felt genuinely reassuring rather than dismissive of our panic. The good news, she said, setting the documents down carefully, is that anonymous donor relinquishment agreements like this one are very strongly protected under the law. Custody claims from donors who've signed comprehensive rights relinquishment are extremely difficult to win, especially this many years after the fact, with an established, stable family structure already in place. Then why does this feel so dangerous? I asked her, my voice catching slightly. Because the actual legal question we need to answer first, Diane said, isn't whether her custody claim will succeed. It's how she found your daughter at all. That's a separate and honestly more urgent mystery than the custody filing itself. I've handled cases like this before, and the how usually matters more than people expect going in. It took Diane's team about a week to trace the actual mechanism, and what they found unsettled me in a completely different way than the initial letter had. Sophie had used a consumer DNA ancestry testing kit for a school genealogy project the previous year, something dozens of her classmates had done for the same assignment, entirely innocent, entirely ordinary. I remembered helping her spit into that little plastic tube at our kitchen table, both of us laughing about how strange the whole process felt, neither of us thinking twice about the privacy implications of a school assignment half her grade was doing simultaneously. That test had matched her, through the service's genetic relative finder feature, to several biological relatives who had also used the same service, distant cousins on the donor's side, people Sophie had never heard of and had no reason to think twice about. Julia Hartman, our daughter's egg donor, had used the same consumer service herself years earlier, out of simple curiosity about her own ancestry, never imagining it would eventually connect her directly to a genetic match she had no legal relationship to at all. So she didn't go looking for Sophie specifically, I said when Diane explained this to us. The database just found the connection for her. That's exactly right, Diane said. And once she saw a genetic match that specific, that close, in an unfamiliar name she couldn't otherwise explain, it apparently didn't take much additional searching to connect the dots. A shared last name in the match results, a quick social media search from there. It's a genuinely modern vulnerability. 15 years ago, when you signed your original agreement, nothing like this scale of consumer genetic testing existed yet. The anonymity our original agreement promised had never been broken by the clinic, by any leak, by any deliberate act of malice. It had been quietly undone by a technology that didn't meaningfully exist at the scale it does now, back when Mark and I signed our original paperwork 15 years earlier. We contacted Dr. Elena Suarez, the current medical director at the fertility clinic we'd used, hoping for some explanation, some reassurance that this couldn't have been foreseen. She was defensive at first, understandably protective of an institution she'd only led for the past several years, long after our original agreement had been signed under previous leadership. But as we walked through exactly what Diane's team had found, her tone shifted into something more genuinely troubled. What we learned instead was that while the clinic itself had never disclosed Julia's identity to us or ours to her, the clinic's original consent paperwork, drafted over 15 years earlier, had never adequately warned either donors or recipients about the emerging risks posed by consumer DNA testing services that simply didn't exist in their current form at the time the agreement was signed. I want to be honest with you, Dr. Suarez said near the end of our conversation. This is a gap I don't think anyone fully anticipated when these original agreements were written. I don't say that to excuse it. I say it because I think it's important you understand this wasn't negligence in the way you might assume. It was a promise that the world simply changed underneath. It wasn't malicious. It was an institutional blind spot, a promise made in good faith that the world had since made harder to keep. Diane's investigation into Julia's own background revealed something that complicated my anger in ways I wasn't fully prepared for. Julia was 38, a freelance graphic designer, and had spent years struggling with her own infertility, unable to conceive despite multiple rounds of treatment. She had no children of her own. Diane's team found, through public records and social media history, a woman whose life had visibly narrowed around this one unresolved grief over the past several years. Fewer posts about her design work, more about fertility struggles, eventually a long gap in posting altogether before a sudden return coinciding, we realized later, almost exactly with when she must have first discovered the DNA match to Sophie. Somewhere in that ongoing grief, the biological connection to a donor-conceived child she'd otherwise had no role in raising had apparently become something she couldn't simply let remain abstract once modern DNA technology made it concretely findable. I found myself uncomfortably, genuinely feeling for her circumstances, even while being furious about what she was doing with them. Both things were true at once, and I didn't love sitting with that complexity. Before any formal legal proceedings advanced further, Julia attempted direct contact with me over email. I remember staring at that message for a long time before showing it to Mark, unsure how to categorize what I was reading. It wasn't threatening in tone. If anything, it read as a genuinely heartfelt, if wildly inappropriate, appeal. She wrote about feeling a connection she couldn't explain, about years of imagining what her donation might have become, about simply wanting to know the daughter she felt tied to, about not intending to disrupt our family so much as to exist somewhere within its orbit. She mentioned, near the end, that she understood if this felt frightening to us, but that she hoped we could eventually understand her side of it too. I read that email probably a dozen times, feeling something shift uncomfortably each time between anger at the presumption of it and a reluctant, unwanted sympathy for whatever genuine pain had produced it. On Diane's clear advice, I didn't respond directly. Any informal contact at that stage, she explained, risked complicating our legal position later, however sympathetically Julia's message had been written. It took real discipline not to respond to someone who, however unintentionally, was actively threatening the stability of my family. I finally deleted the email, choosing silence as a strategy rather than as indifference to what she'd written. Sophie noticed the tension at home before we decided how or when to tell her anything. She's perceptive in a way that's made parenting her both easier and harder than I expected. Easier because she rarely needs things spelled out. Harder because she rarely lets things go unexamined either. Something's wrong, she said one evening, sitting across from me at the kitchen table where the whole thing had started, arms crossed, watching me with the particular directness she's had since she was small. You and Dad have been weird for like 2 weeks. Just tell me. I'd rather know than keep guessing. Mark and I talked that night after she went to bed about exactly how much to share and when. We didn't want to frighten her with something that might resolve itself legally without ever touching her daily life at all. But we also didn't want her finding out secondhand or sensing enough fragments to construct something scarier than the actual truth. We decided, carefully, to tell her an honest, age-appropriate version of the situation, emphasizing clearly and repeatedly that nothing about her actual family was at risk of changing, regardless of how the legal situation resolved. We sat down with her the following evening, all 3 of us at that same kitchen table. I remember watching her face carefully as Mark explained it, the letter, Julia, the DNA test connection, watching for signs of how much this was actually landing versus how much she was simply absorbing without full comprehension yet. Her reaction surprised me. She wasn't frightened in the way I'd braced for. She was curious in a careful, measured way that felt entirely her own. So she's like genetically related to me, Sophie said slowly, working through it out loud, twisting a strand of hair around one finger the way she does when she's thinking hard. But she's not my mom. You're my mom. That's not confusing to me, actually. I don't get why it would need to be a whole legal thing. It shouldn't be, I told her. But some people don't always make the same distinction you just made so clearly. Is she going to try to, take me somewhere? Or make me visit her? Sophie asked, and I could hear, underneath the careful composure, a thread of real fear finally surfacing. No, I said, as firmly as I could manage. Nothing like that is going to happen. We have a lawyer. We have the original paperwork she signed years ago. This is a legal process we're going to handle, and your life isn't going to change because of it. I promise you that. She nodded slowly, seeming to accept that, though I noticed her checking in with both of us more frequently over the following weeks. Small glances across the dinner table that told me the reassurance needed repeating more than once. Julia's attorney formally filed the custody petition about 3 weeks later, despite the original signed relinquishment agreement, arguing that evolving legal standards around donor-conceived children's rights should allow the court to reconsider the enforceability of agreements signed years before current conversations about donor-conceived identity had fully developed. It was, Diane assured us, a legally weak argument. It was also undeniably exhausting, invasive, and expensive to have to formally defend against regardless of its ultimate weakness. The court hearing took place nearly 4 months after that first letter arrived. I remember sitting in that courtroom, Mark's hand tight around mine, watching Diane lay out our case with the same calm precision she'd shown from our very first meeting. She presented the original signed agreement clearly, walked the judge through established legal precedents strongly favoring the enforceability of donor relinquishment contracts, and brought testimony establishing Sophie's stable, uninterrupted family structure across her entire 15 years of life. School records, medical records, letters from teachers and Sophie's pediatrician, a clear, unbroken picture of exactly the kind of stability the law is generally very reluctant to disrupt. Julia testified too, and I want to be honest that it was harder to listen to than I expected. She spoke about her own fertility struggles with real, raw vulnerability, describing years of treatments that never worked, the particular isolation of watching a genetic connection exist in the world without ever being allowed to be part of it. At one point, her voice broke completely, and the courtroom went very quiet while she composed herself enough to continue. I found myself uncomfortably near tears myself at certain points. Even knowing everything she was describing didn't change what she was attempting to do to my family. It was genuinely moving in places. It simply wasn't legally sufficient to overcome the weight of her own signed agreement from 15 years earlier, an agreement she'd entered into as a clear-eyed adult fully aware of what she was relinquishing at the time. Diane made that point plainly but not unkindly during her closing argument, acknowledging Julia's genuine pain while making clear that pain, however real, couldn't retroactively unmake a legally binding decision made years before Sophie was even born. The judge took a recess before delivering her ruling, and those 40 minutes waiting outside the courtroom felt longer than the entire 4 months leading up to it combined. When we were called back in, the judge dismissed Julia's petition entirely, affirming the enforceability of the original agreement and noting Sophie's clearly established, stable existing family structure as effectively decisive on its own. She added, gently but firmly, that she had real sympathy for Ms. Hartman's circumstances, but that sympathy could not become the basis for disrupting a child's settled, stable life. I remember the specific, quiet relief of that ruling, tempered by the exhaustion of 4 months spent defending something that never should have needed defending in the first place. Mark and I didn't celebrate, exactly. We just sat there for a moment, hands still clasped together, letting the weight of it finally lift. Something happened afterward that I hadn't fully anticipated, and that I think, honestly, made the entire resolution feel more complete than the ruling alone ever could have. Several months later, through Diane acting as a careful intermediary, Sophie, with our full support and on terms she herself set entirely, chose to establish limited, voluntary contact with Julia. Not a relationship in any parental sense. A handful of supervised messages, mostly about Julia's own family history and some medical information Sophie was genuinely curious about. Nothing more than that unless Sophie herself ever decided otherwise. I remember asking Sophie, carefully, what had made her want to reach out at all after everything that had happened. She thought about it for a while before answering. I'm mad about what she tried to do, she said. That's not confusing to me either. But I'm also curious about her in a totally different way than being mad about the lawsuit. Like, she's part of where I came from, genetically. I don't think being curious about that means I'm okay with what she did. I think both things can just be true. I get to decide how much room she has in my life, Sophie told me, with a clarity that struck me as remarkable for someone her age. Not her. Not even really you and Dad. Honestly. Though I know you back me up either way. Just me. I couldn't argue with that. I didn't want to. Watching my 15-year-old daughter articulate a boundary that clean, that self-possessed, after everything she'd been asked to absorb over those months, was its own quiet kind of pride, separate entirely from the legal relief of the ruling itself. Our case, combined with Diane's broader advocacy work on similar situations she'd started encountering more frequently as consumer DNA testing has become more widespread, eventually prompted the fertility clinic to update its consent and disclosure practices, specifically adding clear warnings about the risks posed by consumer DNA testing services to both future donors and recipients. Dr. Suarez called us personally to let us know about the change, and I remember appreciating that gesture more than I expected to, a small acknowledgement that our family's difficult months had produced something that might spare another family the same blindside. It was a small, quiet form of justice beyond just our own family's resolution, the kind that doesn't make headlines but genuinely protects families who haven't gone through anything like this yet. I think about Anonymous differently now than I did 15 years ago. It was a real good faith promise at the time it was made, one that simply couldn't have accounted for a world where a curious teenager's school project and a lonely woman's ancestry curiosity would eventually intersect in a database neither of them fully understood the implications of using. The promise wasn't a lie. It was just a promise made before the technology existed to complicate it. Mark and I still keep that original signed agreement in the same fireproof box, though I've made a mental note to also keep a digital copy somewhere more accessible, just in case. Sophie knows where it is too now. She asked to see it herself, once, after everything settled, reading through the legal language slowly, methodically, the same way she reads through anything that matters to her. She didn't say much afterward. She just folded it back carefully and told me she was glad it existed, whatever complicated feelings she still had about the rest of it. She signed a piece of paper 15 years ago that was supposed to make her a stranger forever. Technology she couldn't have imagined back then undid the anonymity, but it never undid the agreement, and in the end, it was my daughter, not any court, who decided exactly how much room this stranger would ever actually have in her life.